Yo, what's up guys, you're back with TechNick, and today we have another comparison between the Mi 10 Pro and the S20 Ultra, though this time it's all about gaming. Yes, those frames per second matter today. We have 5 games all capped at 120 FPS. I'm really excited to see how these two go head to head against each other. Guys, this is TechNick. Without further ado, let's go. These are the hardware configs of both phones. Feel free to hit pause on this screen if you want to see more details on that. We have a 90Hz refresh rate panel on the Xiaomi and 120Hz refresh rate panel on the Samsung. So they are capped at 90 FPS and 120 FPS respectively. We're on max settings here. Our first game here is Bullet Force. It has an absolute max frame rate cap of 120 frames per second, though remember that the Xiaomi's display is limited to 90, so you won't see anything higher than 90, where the Samsung is limited to 120, the game is limited to 120, so it's nice to see that Samsung have actually decided to put 120Hz refresh rate panel on their screen, because all games, well, all high refresh rate games usually support 120 max, where the Xiaomi has a 90 and it cannot exceed that to 120 even when playing a 120 frames per second game such as Bullet Force. I really do dig Bullet Force. If you guys haven't checked out, I suggest you do, because it actually released quite a while before PUBG Mobile and Call of Duty Mobile. It's still one of my favorite shooters, and out of those 3 games it's the only one that natively supports 120 frames per second, where PUBG Mobile only supports that on the Chinese version, which is literally impossible to get unless you have a Chinese identification. Anyway, I've really enjoyed playing Bullet Force, and as you guys can see, the Xiaomi has no problem keeping it at 90 the whole time, where the Samsung kind of fluctuates between 100, 105 and 120, but the Samsung got 113 frames per second there as opposed to the 90 frames per second on the Xiaomi. And if you guys don't believe me about RAM, we have the Xiaomi on 8 gigs of RAM and we have the Samsung with 12 gigs of RAM. We're playing games here and we never seem to use more than 1 gig of RAM when playing these heavy duty 120 FPS games. So guys, RAM does not matter in a gaming test like this whatsoever. It does not make your phone faster. The Xiaomi is at 90 frames per second because it is capped at 90 frames per second. Dead trigger to another natively supporting 120 FPS game. Now remember that when a game supports 120 FPS, the max that you will get on each phone is their max, and then the one just under that is 60. So on the Samsung, you don't have an option for 60 and 90 and 120, you just have 60 and 120, where the Xiaomi, you have 60 and then 90. Of course, there are the options for 30 frames per second modes as well, but why would you want to do that when you have such a high refresh rate panel? Dead Trigger 2 is absolutely amazing. I think it looks stunning, probably the best looking zombie game around. You guys should definitely check it out. I've really been enjoying playing it on all of these phones, and 120 frames per second feels ridiculously smooth. So there we go, Xiaomi, another stable 90 frames per second and another 113 frames per second on the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra. Our next game here is Into the Dead. Yes, I know what you're thinking, Into the Dead 2 is released. Nick, why are you showing us Into the Dead? Well, it's because Into the Dead supports 120 frames per second and Into the Dead 2 does not on these devices. So what I mean by these devices is there's about 100 games that you can play at 120 frames per second that support it, but these phones, the only games I know that they actually support right now are these 5 games. If you guys know any other games, such as I know Gear Club actually supports 120 frames per second, but not on these phones. There are many games, Alto's Odyssey as well, not on these phones. I have tested them out. These are the 5 that support 120 high refresh rate on the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra and the Xiaomi Mi 10 Pro together. Of course, maybe the Samsung can support other games that the Xiaomi cannot, but these are the 5 games that they both support together, and that's why I'm showing you guys this comparison today. The Xiaomi was pretty much stuttering around 90 there. It wasn't always fixed at 90 on Into the Dead 2, though we did still get an average of 90 frames per second. The Samsung was 114. It also went quite low, but it hovered around 110 frames per second. Next game here is Mortal Kombat. Once again, 120 FPS cap on both phones, but the Xiaomi is limited to 90 because of its screen. Another awesome game, and it is slightly more graphically demanding than the other games that we have tested here. This fighting game, it looks absolutely gorgeous, and if you guys have seen the PC or PS4 versions of Mortal Kombat before, you would know that graphics are heavy here. 87 frames, so it actually went below 90 on average on the Xiaomi. 116 went above its usual on the Samsung. Last game of the bunch here is Trials Frontier. It is one of my favorite platforming games on a mobile mobile device, especially on Android. Once again, 90 and 120 on both of the devices. It actually has a max cap of 120. You can see it actually feels smoother when you're playing sports games such as Trials Frontier over here. It feels a lot smoother with 120 FPS. Your bike feels faster. Doing backflips is easier. You can actually feel the frames difference, the 30 frames difference between the Xiaomi and the Samsung over here with 90 and 120 respectively. Both of them did well. The Xiaomi, of course, 90 frames per second on average again. The Samsung, the highest of this test, 118 frames per second there. We have an overall average frames per second on the Samsung of 115 FPS and 89 FPS on the Xiaomi Mi 10 Pro. Though remember that the Xiaomi is capped at 90 FPS, and if it did have a 120 Hz refresh rate panel, then the Xiaomi would perform very similar to the S20 Ultra since they have the same Snapdragon 865 processing chip. I'm really impressed to see that Samsung are hitting very close to 120. Though remember that the Samsung can only be played with 120 FPS when set to 1080p. And until next time, this is TechNick.